first time I stumbled upon the remnants of the family's history, I didn't even know whose story I was uncovering. The town records were sparse, almost deliberately incomplete, and the old cemetery, hidden behind a cluster of withering oaks, offered only half-erased tombstones, with names I could not fully decipher. Yet, even in this fragmented landscape, there was a sense of presence, a shadow of lives once lived, of voices that had once spoken in the homes that now stood abandoned or repurposed. It was as if the very act of erasure had left a residue, a whisper of defiance that refused to be fully silenced. I found the house first, though calling it a house seemed almost too tame. Its stone walls had withstood centuries, yet they were scarred by neglect, the roof sagging, windows shattered, and ivy creeping inside like it wanted to claim the interior as its own. The iron gate, once imposing and proud, now rusted and crooked, gave way with a protest that echoed across the empty street. As I stepped inside, the smell of damp and decay mingled with faint traces of something else, old paper, wax, and the unmistakable residue of fear. This was not merely an abandoned dwelling, it was a vessel of memory, holding tightly to the secrets of the family, whose name had been erased from every official record. The furniture was thick with dust, and sheets had been thrown over the larger pieces, giving the impression that someone had expected to return, but never did. I brushed aside the cobwebs, revealing the intricate carvings on the wooden banister, the faded tapestry on the wall, and the remnants of photographs that time had browned and curled. Faces peered out at me, but I couldn't recognize them. There were no names attached, only the faint suggestion of a lineage determined to vanish. I noticed how each room had its own character: the study with scattered books on history and law, the dining room set as if waiting for a feast that never came, and the bedrooms with personal effects that whispered of ordinary lives interrupted. It was in the study that I found the first hint of the truth. A stack of letters tied with a fraying ribbon, yellowed with age, revealed the meticulous care someone had taken to document their existence. I untied the ribbon carefully, and the scent of old ink rose, carrying with it the gravity of confessions made in secrecy. The letters told of debts owed and betrayals suffered, of threats received and warnings ignored. One letter, written in a hurried, almost panicked hand, mentioned names of people who had vanished without explanation, their disappearances buried beneath false reports and missing files. Reading these, I understood why the family had been erased. They had been systematically dismantled, not by accident, but by design. The house seemed to respond to my presence. Floors groaned under my weight, shutters rattled in the wind, and shadows pooled unnaturally in corners where the sunlight refused to penetrate. I began to notice the details others might have overlooked: scratches on the walls that were not caused by furniture, footprints in the dust that ended abruptly, and faint, indecipherable markings that suggested some kind of ritual or coded message. It was as though the family, in trying to hide from the world, had left behind a map of their own survival, a warning disguised as decoration. Upstairs, I found a locked cabinet, its key missing, but the lock was old enough to yield careful manipulation. Inside were documents far more damning than the letters: ledgers recording payments, blackmail and alliances made in desperation. There were accounts of powerful figures who had wanted the family gone, of whispered threats that had escalated into violent intervention. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that the erasure had been total, a calculated effort to remove not just their name from history, but their influence, their memory, and their very humanity. As dusk fell, the house took on an almost tangible weight. I could feel the anxiety, the fear, the pride, and the sorrow of generations pressing down upon me. The family had left traces, but they had also left a void, a silence, so profound that it seemed to absorb all sound, all motion, all light. Walking through the hallways, I felt their eyes on me, not in malice, but in judgment. I was the one who had stumbled upon what they could not allow to remain in public consciousness, and yet I felt a strange kinship with them. For the first time, I understood that their erasure was both punishment and protection, a shield against a world that would have destroyed them for reasons that seemed both trivial and terrifyingly potent. By the time night fully settled, the house had revealed enough for me to begin connecting the dots. The family had been influential, yes, but their influence had been dangerous, or at least perceived as such by those who held power. They had known secrets that others wanted to remain buried, and their attempts to expose or protect those secrets had put them in conflict with people who could not tolerate opposition. The pattern was clear: threats, disappearances, and finally, the erasure of their very name. Even the legal records had been altered or destroyed, leaving only these haunted walls and scattered remnants to tell the tale. I slept in one of the bedrooms that night. Though the bed was stiff and the sheets mussy, dreams came unbidden, and in them I saw flashes of the family's life: children hiding under tables, parents whispering in corners, and servants whose loyalty had been tested by fear. I woke with a start when the wind blew the shutters violently, and I understood that the house itself had absorbed the trauma of its inhabitants. It was not malevolent, but it was unwilling to let their story be forgotten. I resolved that I would not leave without ensuring that at least a part of the truth survived. By morning, I had organized the letters, the documents, and the scattered papers into a semblance of order. I photographed everything, took detailed notes, and even sketched the markings that had seemed like nonsense. The family's name might have been erased from history, but within these pages their presence remained undeniable. They had lived, they had struggled, they had suffered, and they had left a legacy of secrets too dangerous to ignore. And now, for the first time, someone would bear witness. Walking away from the house, I cast one last glance at its sagging roof and ivy-clad wall. The shadows seemed to shift, almost in recognition, as if acknowledging that I understood the stakes. I carried with me, not just letters and ledgers, but a story that had been denied a voice for generations. The family whose name was erased had not vanished entirely. They had merely waited for someone willing to uncover the dark truth they had tried to hide, and I had become that witness. The morning light cast a pale glow across the street, and the house, even in daylight, seemed to brood over its secrets. I lingered at the edge of the property, reluctant to leave, knowing that the story I had begun to uncover was far from complete. There was more to the family than the letters and documents could reveal. History had attempted to smooth over the edges of their lives, to create a narrative of absence, but the traces were stubborn. They were stitched into the very fabric of the house, embedded in the furniture, the floors and the walls. I needed to see beyond the paper, to understand the patterns of their daily existence, and the subtle signs that had led to their ultimate erasure. I started by mapping the house room by room, noting anomalies and inconsistencies. The dining room, for instance, seemed ordinary at first glance: a long table, chairs neatly arranged, silverware tarnished by time. But the table bore scratch marks, almost imperceptible, running in parallel lines across its surface. I crouched to inspect them more closely, and realized they weren't random. They were deliberate, a form of coded communication, left by someone who had anticipated surveillance or intrusion. Each set of scratches corresponded to a sequence of letters or numbers, a system I would later decode from cross-referencing the letters in the study. The bedrooms told a different story. Clothes, personal effects, and toys suggested children had lived here, their presence a fragile counterpoint to the oppressive weight of the house. One bedroom, in particular, contained a small diary, tucked beneath a floorboard. The leather was brittle, the pages faint with age, but the handwriting was clear enough to read. It belonged to a girl no older than 12. Her entries were a mix of ordinary childhood reflections and unsettling observations, whispers she heard at night, shadows moving independently of the wind, and the recurring sensation that someone or something was always watching. Her last entry was abruptly cut off, ending mid-sentence as if she had been interrupted, or worse, taken
The diary reinforced what the letters hinted at. The family's erasure was not only social or legal, it had been profoundly personal and terrifyingly immediate. I moved to the attic next, a space that had been largely ignored in the initial examination. Cobwebs hung like delicate curtains, and dust covered every surface. But amidst the decay, I discovered something extraordinary. A collection of objects arranged meticulously, almost ritualistically. There were small carved figurines, tiny masks, and pieces of fabric dyed in vibrant but now faded colors. At first they seemed like simple heirlooms, yet the arrangement suggested intent, a message or defense system created to protect the family, or perhaps conceal knowledge they deemed too dangerous to leave exposed. I photographed every item, noting the symbols and patterns, aware that these objects were another layer of the story erased from public record. In the library, I encountered the most revealing documents yet: correspondence between members of the family and various officials, some local, some from distant cities. These letters revealed a web of relationships, alliances, and threats. It became clear that the family had been caught in a silent war, one fought not with weapons, but with influence, secrets, and subtle manipulations. The family had uncovered information that others wanted buried. Perhaps it was financial misdeeds, perhaps political secrets, perhaps something darker. Whatever it was, the consequences of exposure had been severe: forced disappearances, manipulated legal outcomes, and systematic efforts to erase the family from historical memory. I realized that the house itself was a character in this story. The floorboards creaked underfoot, groaning as though in complaint. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners. In the faint light, I saw scratches on the walls and ceiling, markings that echoed those on the dining table.
In one of the bedrooms, I found an old trunk tucked beneath the window. Its surface was scuffed and worn, but the lock was intricate and complex, suggesting both value and secrecy. With careful manipulation, I managed to open it, revealing a collection of personal items, photographs, journals, and letters. The photographs were of ordinary family life at first glance, but closer inspection revealed subtleties. Certain individuals were conspicuously absent from some images, while others had been carefully edited out or crossed over. The journals contained accounts of daily routines, financial records, and social interactions. It became evident that the family had meticulously documented their lives, anticipating that if they were removed or silenced, the story could still survive through these hidden archives. The attic, revisited for the third time, revealed new layers. I examined the objects more closely. The carved figurines, masks, and colored fabrics were arranged not randomly, but in precise alignments that mirrored the constellations. It was as if the family had embedded their messages within a celestial framework, linking earthly events with a greater, symbolic pattern. This discovery suggested a level of intentionality far beyond ordinary secrecy. The family's actions were both practical and ritualistic, a means of ensuring that their experiences, warnings, and perhaps even knowledge of the town's hidden transgressions would endure. I stepped outside briefly to clear my mind and noticed that the surrounding environment mirrored the house's peculiarities. Trees were pruned or broken in ways that created natural barriers, guiding visitors along certain paths while discouraging others. The garden, overgrown but deliberately landscaped, concealed shallow depressions and markers that might indicate buried objects. The family had extended their control beyond the walls of the house itself, creating an entire environment designed to communicate, protect, and perhaps mislead. By the time I returned inside, dusk had begun to fall, casting long shadows across the floors. I sat in the study once more, poring over notes and photographs, attempting to piece together the chronology of events. It was clear that the family had been trapped in a cycle of surveillance, secrecy, and survival. Their lives were not merely defined by the threat of erasure, but by their persistent efforts to circumvent it. Every mark, every object,
Every word was an act of defiance, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. As night fell completely, I felt the weight of the house's presence more acutely. It was a living archive, a repository of memory and warning. I realized that my role had shifted. I was no longer just an observer, but a participant in the family's ongoing struggle for remembrance. To leave the house without understanding its full story would be to participate in the very erasure I sought to combat. I knew that tomorrow I would continue my investigation, focusing on the hidden patterns, the coded messages, and the connections between the family and the town that had tried to forget them. The house remained silent, yet I could sense its awareness, as if it acknowledged my intention. I left with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying both the burden and the privilege of interpreting the story that had been deliberately hidden. The family's legacy, though obscured by time and deliberate suppression, was beginning to surface, layer by painstaking layer, through the documents, objects, and subtle traces they had left behind. And I understood that the deeper I delved, the closer I would come to fully grasping the dark truth they had fought so hard to conceal. The morning mist clung to the edges of the town as I returned to the house, the damp air, carrying the faint smell of decay, mixed with the scent of moss and wet earth. It was a place caught between time and neglect, and each step toward the threshold seemed to echo with warnings from the past. I paused for a moment, listening, as though the wind itself carried the voices of the family who had vanished. The creaking of the gate sounded almost like a sigh, an acknowledgement of my intrusion into their carefully preserved narrative. Inside, the air was heavier than usual, as if the house itself had absorbed the secrets and anxieties of generations. I started in the living room, where the furniture remained as it had been left, dust-coated, worn and yet meticulously arranged. On the mantel I noticed a series of photographs that I had not seen before. They depicted events that were seemingly mundane: birthdays, weddings, everyday moments, but the subtle inconsistencies suggested that someone had deliberately altered them. Faces were blurred or scratched out, objects shifted, and even the lighting in certain photographs seemed manipulated to draw attention to specific details. The family had been careful, intentional, and precise in leaving markers for those perceptive enough to note it. I turned my attention to the walls, where faded wallpaper held faint impressions, as though the outline of objects pressed against them had been captured over time. I traced my fingers over these patterns, finding subtle anomalies, small holes in the wall, carefully hidden behind frames, as if someone had used them to conceal messages or objects. The idea that every element in the house might be a deliberate act of communication weighed on me. It was not just a residence, it was a layered archive, a repository of coded history. Moving toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, I noticed a narrow side passage I had overlooked before. The walls here were lined with shelves, some holding books, others jars filled with what appeared to be natural elements, dried herbs, powders, and carefully labeled specimens. These were catalogued with precision, notes scribbled in the margins in a handwriting that shifted slightly from the letters I had previously examined. It was clear that the family had been experimenting, recording, observing, documenting not just events but processes, perhaps even forms of protection or ritual. The meticulous nature of the notes suggested a desire to preserve knowledge, to safeguard understanding that might otherwise be lost to time or deliberate erasure. In one small alcove, a hidden drawer in the wall contained a bundle of correspondence, each letter tied with frayed ribbon. The content of these letters was a revelation. They spoke of alliances, betrayals, and a web of relationships both within the town and extending beyond it. There were references to debts owed, favors called in, and threats implied, but never fully articulated. The family had navigated a delicate social network, balancing visibility with secrecy, trust with suspicion. The letters hinted that their eventual erasure from the public record was not entirely natural. It had been orchestrated, a consequence of conflicts and decisions whose reverberations persisted long after the family's disappearance. I took the letters carefully to the study, spreading them across the desk for comparison. Patterns began to emerge, repeated references to specific names, places, and dates. Some letters were overt, detailing everyday interactions, while others were written in a coded shorthand, a personal cipher designed to obscure meaning from anyone outside the family. The dual nature of these communications, the transparent and the concealed, was striking. The family had mastered the art of layered truth, providing enough information to survive in public, while safeguarding the most critical knowledge in forms that could only be deciphered by those who understood the code. As the hours passed, I moved from room to room, cataloging objects, photographs, and documents, piecing together fragments of a story that had been deliberately obscured. One striking discovery was a small notebook, its leather cover cracked and worn. Inside, the entries were brief but precise, documenting routines, observations, and most chillingly instances of threats, messages received, unexplained disappearances of acquaintances, and subtle forms of coercion. It became apparent that the family's erasure had not been sudden or accidental, but the result of a calculated campaign. Their enemies had been patient, methodical, and relentless, erasing every trace of their existence from public records, from social memory, and even from the physical space of the town. The attic, revisited again, revealed further layers. I noticed that certain objects were deliberately placed to correspond with architectural features, figurines aligned with beams, fabrics draped to direct attention to corners, even furniture positioned to obscure certain views. It was as though the family had designed the house itself to guide perception, to encode information in ways both subtle and profound. Every room, every object, every angle seemed to carry significance, a message waiting to be understood by someone who would look closely enough. By late afternoon, I found myself standing in the main hallway, reflecting on the enormity of what I had uncovered. The family's legacy was not merely in the documents, photographs, or objects, but in the very structure of the house itself. It was a living, breathing record of defiance and survival, a testament to resilience in the face of systemic erasure. The house had become a vessel for memory, a medium through which the family's presence persisted even after their disappearance. As dusk approached, I felt the weight of responsibility settle upon me. The family's story, though hidden, was reaching me through every object, every letter, every carefully concealed mark. To leave the house without fully understanding it would be to betray their meticulous effort, their desire to be remembered, and their struggle against forces determined to silence them. I realized that my journey was not merely about uncovering the past, it was about bearing witness to it, interpreting it accurately, and ensuring that the dark truth they had tried to hide would finally be known. Stepping outside for a final moment, I observed the surrounding landscape. The overgrown gardens, the shadowed pathways, and the twisted trees all spoke of a family deeply entwined with their environment, shaping it as carefully as they had shaped their own narrative. The town beyond seemed oblivious to the intricacies that lay within this single house, yet I now understood that the true history had been preserved here, meticulously, in layers of secrecy, defiance, and intelligence. As night fell, I knew that tomorrow would demand further investigation, a deeper dive into the coded correspondences, the hidden compartments, and the architectural subtleties that had been designed to communicate knowledge beyond the family's erasure. The house, alive with its secrets, had begun to reveal its story, and I understood that the path ahead would be both challenging and crucial. To uncover the full truth would require patience, intuition, and a careful balance of caution and curiosity. The family's legacy, carefully buried in plain sight, was beginning to unfold, one revelation at a time. By the next morning, a cold clarity had settled over me. The house seemed quieter than before, as if it had absorbed my presence overnight, and was now observing my every move. I returned to the study where the letters and notebooks had been spread across the desk, and I began to piece together a sequence of events that had led to the family's erasure. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that their disappearance had been orchestrated with deliberate precision, an intricate web of manipulation, secrecy, and intimidation that spanned decades. The notebooks revealed patterns I had not noticed before. Each entry, brief as it might seem, was meticulously dated and cross-referenced with other documents. There were references to visits from townspeople who on the surface seemed ordinary, but in hindsight, carried an underlying tension. The family had recorded everything: conversations, gifts, debts, disagreements, and even subtle facial expressions that conveyed suspicion or resentment. It was a record not just of events, but of intent, a methodical chronicle of the social dynamics that had slowly shifted against them. One passage stood out, describing a dinner party hosted by the family, where alliances and rivalries had been laid bare. The text detailed how a neighbor, outwardly cordial, had subtly undermined the family's reputation, planting seeds of doubt and spreading whispers that eventually led to formal complaints and social isolation. Another entry recorded a series of financial transactions that appeared innocuous at first glance, but when read together, suggested a deliberate attempt to destabilize the family's economic foundation. Every action seemed calculated, a single strand in a larger plan to erase the family from memory. I noticed that many of the letters were addressed to individuals who no longer existed in any records I could find. Names that should have been familiar were absent from town registries, census data, and even church records. It was as if the family and their associates had been systematically removed, not through death alone, but through a combination of relocation, falsified documentation, and deliberate social erasure. The letters hinted at strategies for survival, methods to protect secrets, and warnings about those who sought to exploit or harm them. The family had been both vigilant and vulnerable, aware of the dangers yet constrained by the very society they tried to navigate. As I moved through the house, I returned to the side passage with the shelves of jars, powders, and herbs. It became clear that these were not mere curiosities, they were part of a deliberate practice, perhaps a form of alchemy, preservation, or protection. The labels included not just ingredients, but instructions, measurements, and intended effects. Some jars contained mixtures designed to mask scents, obscure traces, or even alter appearances. Others were intended to safeguard documents or objects from tampering. The family's attention to detail extended beyond mere observation. It encompassed a sophisticated understanding of concealment, chemistry, and human behavior. In the attic, I discovered yet another hidden compartment, this one containing a small, intricately carved box. Inside were objects that seemed mundane at first, keys, coins, and trinkets, but each was marked with symbols, initials, or numbers that corresponded with other records in the house. The family had created a network of references, a cross-referencing system, that allowed them to encode information across multiple locations. It was an intelligence network within their own home, a private archive that documented not just their lives but the strategies, threats, and contingencies that had defined their existence. The family's ingenuity was both fascinating and chilling. Their survival depended on their ability to anticipate threats, manipulate appearances, and encode knowledge in ways that would withstand both time and deliberate attempts at erasure. They had anticipated scrutiny, betrayal, and even violence, and they responded with methods that combined practicality, psychology, and careful documentation. The result was a house that functioned as a living record, a repository of strategies and secrets that could only be fully understood by someone willing to navigate its complexity. As I worked through the afternoon, I came across a series of sketches depicting the town and its surroundings. The drawings were precise, almost architectural, and included notes about the placement of people, objects, and events. Some sketches depicted the family's interactions with outsiders, highlighting moments of negotiation, deception, and conflict. Others focused on interior spaces, showing hidden compartments, lines of sight, and escape routes. The sketches were both practical and symbolic, representing not just physical realities but also social and psychological landscape. One particular sketch caught my attention. It illustrated a path through the woods behind the house, a route that was overgrown now, but had once been meticulously maintained. Notes indicated that it had been used for discreet travel, allowing the family to move without being observed. There were references to meetings with allies, delivery of messages, and retrieval of hidden objects. This pathway, long forgotten, was a testament to the family's foresight, their understanding of geography as a tool of strategy, and their relentless desire to maintain control over their own narrative. By evening, I realized that the family's story was far more complex than I had imagined. They had not been passive victims of circumstance. They had been active participants in their own survival, navigating a web of social, financial, and psychological threats with intelligence and determination. Yet despite their efforts, Forces beyond their control had succeeded in erasing much of their presence, leaving only fragments and coded messages to testify to their existence. As I prepared to leave for the night, I felt a renewed sense of responsibility. Each discovery, each document, and each hidden object was a key to understanding the broader narrative of erasure, resilience, and defiance. The house had revealed layers of strategy, intelligence, and foresight that demanded careful analysis and preservation. To leave without fully grasping the implications of these discoveries would be to abandon the family's legacy and the intricate record they had left behind. Outside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and decay. I paused to look back at the house, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. The windows reflected a faint glimmer of light from the interior, hinting at the secrets contained within. I knew that the journey ahead would be arduous, requiring patience, insight, and careful attention to detail. The family's story was not merely about disappearance, it was about intelligence, foresight, and the relentless pursuit of survival against forces determined to erase them.
The house had begun to speak to me in subtle ways, revealing patterns, strategies, and truths that could only be understood through immersion, observation, and interpretation. Each day brought new insights, new connections, and new revelations, and I understood that the process of uncovering the family's narrative would be ongoing. To fully grasp the dark truth they had tried to hide, I would need to follow every clue, examine every object, and consider every letter, sketch, and artifact within its broader context. The task was monumental, but the story was worth the effort. The morning light filtered through the tall, narrow windows, casting long, cold shadows across the room. I returned to the study, now more familiar yet still intimidating in its density of secrets. Every document, every envelope, every notebook seemed to carry a purpose beyond the obvious. The family's meticulous record-keeping had created a lattice of information that demanded careful navigation. A single misstep in interpretation could obscure the truth entirely. Yet I felt compelled to proceed, to uncover the layers that had led to their erasure, and to understand the mechanisms of the dark forces they had faced. I began with a set of letters tied together with faded ribbon. These letters were written in careful script, with words chosen as precisely as a scalpel cuts flesh. They detailed not only interactions with neighbors and townsfolk, but also the family's internal discussions. There was tension in every line, debates over whether to trust certain individuals, arguments over strategic decisions, and reflections on the morality of actions taken for survival. The letters revealed that the family's cohesion was constantly tested, that the very act of defending themselves required a delicate balance between unity and individual discretion. One letter described an incident in which a family member confronted a local magistrate over a false claim. The entry noted that the magistrate had been bribed, influenced by hidden powers intent on dismantling the family's reputation. The narrative continued with meticulous notes about who was present, what was said, and the likely motivations behind each action. The family had clearly recognized that words could be weapons, that alliances and enmities were fluid, and that survival often depended on reading between the lines. This awareness of social dynamics was as vital to their endurance as their physical security measures. Turning my attention to another notebook, I discovered records of unusual events in the town surrounding their home, people disappearing, businesses mysteriously failing, and whispered rumors that no one would officially acknowledge. The family had recorded these occurrences with an almost clinical detachment, noting dates, participants, and potential causes. It was evident that they were mapping the threats around them, creating a mental and physical map of danger zones, influential actors, and safe haven. Their attention to detail suggested an extraordinary awareness of the environment and an acute understanding of the unseen forces shaping their world. In the corner of the room, a set of small, leather-bound journals caught my eye. These journals were personal, intimate, and emotionally raw.
The entries revealed fears that were not visible in the letters or formal records, the anxiety of living under constant scrutiny, the grief of witnessing betrayal, and the weight of responsibility for younger or more vulnerable family members. Through these personal reflections, I began to grasp the human cost of their resilience. Survival had demanded not only strategy and foresight, but also emotional endurance, a capacity to endure fear, isolation, and uncertainty without breaking. The journals also contained sketches of the house and surrounding property, annotated with notes about lines of sight, potential entry points, and observation position. The family had clearly engaged in ongoing surveillance of their own environment, treating the home as both sanctuary and fortress. Paths through the woods, hidden alcoves, and obscure doorways were mapped with precision, suggesting both practicality and a deep awareness of spatial psychology. They understood that control over space equated to control over safety, and their careful documentation reflected a mind trained to anticipate, analyze, and respond. As I explored further, I found a collection of documents that appeared to be external communications, letters sent to lawyers, merchants, and distant relatives. Many had been intercepted or returned unopened, their contents censored or manipulated by third parties. It became clear that the family's isolation was not only social, but also systemic. Forces within the town, perhaps with extended influence, had sought to sever their connections and prevent them from garnering support. The extent of this coordinated effort was staggering, indicating a level of intent and planning that went far beyond simple misfortune or coincidence. Among these communications, a recurring theme emerged: warning. The family had repeatedly documented instructions for safeguarding critical information, securing valuables, and managing perception. Instructions about how to respond to inquiries, how to obscure evidence, and how to protect younger generations were carefully written and cross-referenced with other materials in the house. It was as if they anticipated that every thread of their life could be threatened, and that the only way to ensure survival was to build a comprehensive, fail-safe network of knowledge and strategy. In one particularly revealing entry, the family described a confrontation with a distant cousin who had attempted to exploit their vulnerabilities for personal gain. The confrontation, detailed with precise timing, dialogue, and consequences, underscored the level of vigilance required in their daily existence. Betrayal was not a rare occurrence. It was an expected variable in the family's calculation. This insight illuminated why the family had maintained such a meticulous record system, why every interaction, no matter how trivial, was documented, and why secrecy had become both a shield and a weapon. By late afternoon, I had begun to piece together the overarching pattern. The family's erasure was not accidental, but a result of calculated social, economic, and psychological pressures. Their meticulous records were both evidence and defense, a testament to their ingenuity, foresight, and unyielding determination to survive in the face of forces intent on their destruction. The house itself was a participant in this process, designed to conceal, protect, and communicate in ways that only those familiar with its systems could fully understand. Every corner, every compartment, every document was part of an intricate mechanism aimed at outmaneuvering their adversary. Before leaving the study, I examined a stack of maps that included surrounding properties, roadways, and town layouts. The family had annotated these maps with notes on neighbors, potential threats, and escape routes. There were indications of safe houses, discrete meeting points, and concealed paths for movement under cover of darkness. This strategic awareness reinforced the impression that the family had not only survived by wit and observation, but had also engaged in a form of tactical planning, akin to military intelligence. Their approach was systematic, deliberate, and above all adaptive. As night fell, I realized that the story of the family's erasure was far more complex than I had initially understood. Survival had demanded an extraordinary combination of intelligence, vigilance, and emotional fortitude. Their efforts to protect themselves and preserve knowledge were extraordinary, reflecting both the gravity of the threats they faced and the depth of their resourcefulness. Each artifact, letter, and journal revealed a dimension of their lives that spoke to resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring human desire to assert agency in the face of overwhelming odds. I left the house with the sense that I had only begun to uncover the magnitude of what had occurred. The family's erasure was a product of relentless pressure, but it was also a testament to their courage and intelligence. Understanding the mechanisms of their survival and the strategies employed against them would require further investigation, patience, and careful interpretation of every detail recorded within the walls of the house. Yet I was committed to the task. Their story demanded recognition, analysis, and preservation. The following morning, a gray mist hung over the property, shrouding the house and its surroundings in an eerie, almost unreal atmosphere. I returned to the study, now carrying the weight of what I had uncovered in Part 6. The documents, maps, and personal journals had revealed the family's acute awareness of danger, their strategies for survival, and the sheer intensity of the pressure they endured. Yet, there was more layers of subtlety and nuance that required closer inspection, a deeper reading between the lines. I began by revisiting the journals of the younger family members, those whose voices had been quieter in earlier entries. Their writing was less structured, more spontaneous, and emotionally charged. These entries revealed the psychological impact of living under constant scrutiny, the strain of maintaining composure while under the threat of erasure, and the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which fear infiltrated every facet of daily life. One entry, in particular, described a day when a trusted neighbor unexpectedly turned against them. The sense of betrayal and the subsequent scramble to protect personal belongings and family records painted a vivid picture of their vulnerability. It became clear that survival had not been simply a matter of planning and intelligence, but also of enduring a relentless psychological toll. Next, I turned to the letters that had been exchanged with distant family members and allies. Some were mundane in tone, discussing matters of property or inheritance, yet the margins were filled with coded annotations, warnings, and instructions. These subtle notes suggested a sophisticated system of communication designed to preserve information without drawing attention. It was a language of survival, where even the most ordinary correspondence carried hidden meanings and potential consequences. Decoding these nuances offered insight into how the family navigated a social landscape rife with treachery and danger, balancing openness with discretion. A set of notebooks detailed interactions with local authorities and community leaders. The family had clearly documented every meeting, every promise, and every slight, creating a meticulous record that could be referenced if disputes arose. The entries were analytical, describing not only the facts, but also the motives and likely future actions of those involved. In one case, a municipal official had attempted to seize property under questionable circumstances, and the family's notes chronicled the step-by-step strategy employed to resist and counteract the effort. It was an intricate dance, combining legal knowledge, social influence, and psychological insight to safeguard both assets and reputation. In a corner of the room, I found a portfolio of sketches depicting the interior of the house, the surrounding grounds, and the nearby town. These drawings were annotated with observations on sightlines, areas of potential vulnerability, and tactical considerations. The family had approached their environment as both home and fortress, understanding that control over space was crucial to maintaining security. The sketches suggested foresight, intelligence, and a proactive approach to danger that went beyond mere reaction. They were mapping both physical and social landscapes, anticipating challenges, and preparing responses in advance. Among the personal effects, I discovered diaries that revealed the emotional and relational dynamics within the household. Sibling rivalries, parental anxieties, and intergenerational tensions were all chronicled with honesty and sensitivity. These entries highlighted the human cost of survival, showing that even in a highly disciplined and strategic family, emotions could not be entirely suppressed. Love, fear, resentment, and hope all intertwined, shaping decisions and influencing behavior. It became evident that the family's endurance was as much about emotional resilience as it was about intelligence and planning. A particularly compelling discovery was a series of financial ledgers documenting expenditures, investments, and transfers of assets. The records were detailed to the last cent, demonstrating an extraordinary level of diligence and foresight. It was clear that financial acumen was integral to the family's survival strategy. They had to manage not only threats from individuals and institutions, but also the broader economic landscape, ensuring that resources were allocated wisely, and that no vulnerability could be exploited through financial mismanagement. Every entry reflected careful calculation, and every transaction was part of a broader defensive strategy. I then examined a collection of letters addressed to outsiders who had previously attempted to interfere with the family's affairs. The correspondence was formal, precise, and often veiled in polite language, yet beneath the surface lay a network of warnings, deterrents, and subtle psychological maneuvers. The family had mastered the art of influence, understanding that perception and reputation were powerful by carefully managing how they were seen and how others interpreted their actions. They could create a protective barrier around themselves, discouraging interference and safeguarding their autonomy. Even as I absorbed this information, I began to notice a recurring theme: anticipation. The family's records, letters, journals, and sketches all reflected a mindset oriented toward foresight, prediction, and preparation. They did not merely react to threats, they actively sought to understand potential outcomes, evaluate risks, and implement strategies to mitigate harm. This level of vigilance was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, yet it was necessary. Their existence had become a continuous exercise in scenario planning, requiring constant attention to detail and an unwavering commitment to survival. By late afternoon, I shifted my focus to the family's personal artifacts, photographs, heirlooms, and symbolic objects. These items held more than sentimental value. They were imbued with meaning, functioning as reminders of identity, resilience, and legacy. Each object told a story, representing a triumph, a loss, or a lesson learned. Preserving these artifacts was as important as documenting events or managing relationships. They served as anchors, connecting the family to its history and providing a tangible sense of continuity amid the relentless pressures they faced. As evening approached, I reflected on the magnitude of what I had uncovered. The family's survival had depended on a delicate interplay of strategy, psychology, social awareness, financial management, and emotional resilience. Every aspect of their lives had been meticulously orchestrated to protect against erasure, and yet the toll of such vigilance was profound. I could feel the weight of their existence, the constant tension between concealment and action, trust and suspicion, hope and fear. Understanding this balance was crucial to appreciating the extraordinary lengths they had gone to maintain their name and their legacy. I left the study with a renewed sense of purpose, realizing that each discovery brought me closer to comprehending the full scope of the family's experience. The challenge was immense: to interpret, contextualize, and honor their story without oversimplifying the complexities or minimizing the human cost. As I walked through the house one last time before nightfall, I could almost hear the echoes of their deliberations, the quiet hum of strategy, and the unspoken fears that had guided every decision. Their story was one of endurance, intellect, and resilience, and I was determined to reveal it in its entirety. Morning arrived with an almost unnatural quiet, the kind of stillness that pressed against the ears and settled deep into the bone. I returned to the main hall of the house, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. In these portraits, I could sense the weight of expectation and vigilance, a silent testament to the burdens the family carried across generations. Every frame, every painted gaze, held the legacy of survival, and as I moved from room to room, I began to notice patterns, repeated behaviors, ritualistic routines, and subtle indicators of discipline that had governed even the smallest aspects of daily life. The family's journals continued to reveal their intricate methods of navigating the outside world. One particular passage caught my attention. It described a confrontation with a neighboring landowner who had threatened to claim a portion of their property. The family's response was calculated, meticulous, and unflinching. They documented every word spoken, every gesture observed, and every potential angle of manipulation. In reading this, I realized how deeply the family understood human nature, not just in general terms, but in its most specific tactical forms. They anticipated greed, envy, and malice, and they positioned themselves to respond before these forces could fully manifest. Next, I examined a collection of ledgers and accounting books spanning decades. Each entry was carefully annotated, not only with financial details, but also with contextual notes: who had made requests for loans, which transactions might draw scrutiny, and which assets were vulnerable to outside interference. Their wealth had been more than a means of comfort, it was a tool of survival. By understanding the flow of resources and controlling them with precision, they could mitigate threats, influence decisions, and maintain autonomy. Every dollar, every investment, every transfer had been a calculated step in a larger, ongoing strategy for preservation. A series of letters exchanged with distant relatives and associates added another layer to this intricate web. The letters were often innocuous on the surface, discussing family events or business matters, but marginal notes and coded phrases hinted at a hidden dialogue. It was a language designed to communicate urgency without alarm, strategy without exposure. In one particularly striking instance, a letter described a subtle shift in local politics and advised immediate, discreet action. The family's ability to read between lines, interpret nuance, and react without revealing panic was extraordinary. Their communication skills were as refined and vital as any financial or tactical plan. I then turned to a portfolio of sketches and diagrams that documented the property in meticulous detail. Hallways were mapped, vantage points were marked, and escape routes were sketched with precision. Even the surrounding terrain, the layout of gardens, fences, and nearby streets, was annotated with potential vulnerabilities and tactical advantages. These drawings demonstrated not only foresight but also a profound understanding of spatial psychology. The family treated their home as both sanctuary and strategic stronghold, using its architecture to reinforce safety while maintaining a semblance of normalcy. Every line drawn carried the weight of calculation and necessity. In the library, I found diaries that offered a window into the emotional and psychological landscape of the household. These entries revealed tension, anxiety, and moments of quiet defiance. Sibling dynamics, parental pressures, and the complexities of intergenerational relationships were laid bare in intimate detail. It became evident that the family's life of vigilance was not just strategic, but deeply taxing. Emotions ran high, loyalties were tested, and trust was both vital and fragile. Their survival depended as much on emotional intelligence as on planning and resource management.
Among the personal artifacts, I found objects imbued with symbolic meaning, heirlooms, talismans, and keepsakes that connected the family to their past. These items served as both reminders and motivators, tangible links to history and identity. Preserving these artifacts was a way of asserting existence in the face of erasure. Each object told a story of triumph, loss, or lesson, and together they created a network of memory and identity that reinforced the family's sense of self and purpose. The day progressed, and I shifted focus to the family's interactions with outsiders. Records of meetings, notes on conversations, and strategic plans revealed a deep awareness of power dynamics. They were constantly assessing the intentions of others, weighing risks, and preparing contingencies. In one case, a previously friendly associate had shown signs of betrayal. The family's response was swift but measured. They withdrew resources, monitored movements, and ensured that no vulnerability could be exploited. Their approach was proactive, not reactive, a hallmark of their enduring survival strategy. Late afternoon brought me to correspondence involving legal matters. The family had maintained meticulous records of disputes, claims, and contracts. Each document reflected careful consideration of consequences and potential threats. They had studied not only the law, but also the tendencies of local authorities, predicting how rules might be interpreted or manipulated. Their legal acumen was a form of defense, a way to assert control over forces that might otherwise overwhelm them. It was a silent, ongoing battle, fought with intelligence and precision rather than violence or confrontation. Finally, I examined a series of reflective personal writings, where the family members documented their hopes, regrets, and lessons learned. These passages revealed profound awareness of the fragility of existence, the impermanence of security, and the importance of resilience. Every choice, every action, every precaution was informed by a deep understanding of risk and consequence. Their endurance had not come from chance, but from discipline, foresight, and an unwavering commitment to survival. Even in the face of fear and uncertainty, they continued to strategize, adapt, and protect one another, aware that failure was not an option. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the house, I left the study once again, weighed down by the enormity of what I had uncovered. The family's life had been a delicate balance of vigilance, intellect, emotional fortitude, and strategic planning. Every facet of their existence was shaped by the need to avoid erasure, to preserve identity, and to safeguard legacy. Walking through the dim corridors, I could almost sense their presence, the quiet determination, the watchful eyes, and the unspoken understanding that survival required constant vigilance. Their story was one of endurance, cunning, and resilience, a testament to the lengths a family would go to protect itself against forces that sought to annihilate its name and history. The evening settled with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made every creak of the floorboards feel like a deliberate warning. I returned to the family's private chambers, those rooms that had been kept off limits to casual visitors for decades. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and polished leather, mingling with faint traces of candle wax. As I opened the door, a slight draft carried with it the faintest whisper of history, a residue of countless conversations, secrets, and silent judgments that had unfolded in this very space. What struck me immediately was the organization of the room. Every item, every piece of furniture seemed to occupy a precise location dictated not by aesthetics, but by necessity. Chairs were positioned for observation, tables placed for both work and concealment, and rugs arranged to muffle footsteps while allowing swift movement if the need arose. It became clear that the house itself had been transformed into a tool of the family's survival, a living instrument of strategy, where even the act of walking from one room to another was calculated and purposeful. I began examining the personal effects left behind: locked boxes, sealed envelopes, and small, intricately carved chests. Each container carried its own story, meticulously annotated with dates, names, and coded messages. One small chest, in particular, contained letters exchanged between distant relatives who had once attempted to interfere with the family's affairs. The letters revealed both the cunning of the family and their ability to neutralize threats without exposing their vulnerability. Through subtle manipulation, careful observation, and strategic withholding of information, they had ensured that their adversaries never fully understood the power dynamics at play. Another chest contained tools of correspondence and secrecy, fine writing instruments, ink pots, and a collection of paper and parchment. The family's ability to communicate across distance without losing clarity or precision became evident in the letters and notes I found. They wrote with foresight, encoding instructions, warnings, and advice in ways that appeared ordinary to outsiders, but were loaded with meaning for those who understood the content. Even small choices of words were deliberate, calculated to guide actions, shape perception, and protect their secrets. In the corner of one room, I discovered a series of personal diaries, bound in faded leather and inscribed in careful, deliberate handwriting. These journals offered glimpses into the psychological burdens the family bore. They documented fears, anxieties, and the relentless pressure of maintaining secrecy while navigating the complexities of social expectation. The entries revealed a family intensely aware of the fragility of trust, the necessity of vigilance, and the high cost of mistakes. For every moment of triumph, there were passages filled with caution, calculation, and the quiet tension of enduring uncertainty. The diaries also highlighted the psychological tactics the family employed to preserve cohesion. They chronicled moments of disagreement,
episodes of potential rebellion, and strategies for realigning internal relationships. Every conflict was carefully mediated, with a clear understanding of personalities and potential outcomes. Loyalty was nurtured, dissent monitored, and familial bonds reinforced, not through coercion, but through subtle influence and carefully structured incentive. The family had created a microcosm where survival depended on both intellect and emotional intelligence, a system that demanded attentiveness and adaptability from every member. I turned next to the property itself, as documented in maps, floor plans, and observation sketches. The family's understanding of their environment was extraordinary. Hallways were mapped with attention to sight lines, potential blind spots noted, and access points analyzed for both opportunity and risk. The grounds surrounding the house had been documented with equal precision. The placement of trees, fences, and outbuildings all factored into their defensive planning. The family's relationship with space was tactical, a constant interplay between concealment, observation, and control. Even the natural elements, the wind, terrain, and seasonal changes were accounted for, demonstrating a profound integration of environment into strategy. One particularly fascinating discovery was a set of coded messages and symbols etched into furniture, walls, and personal items. These markings served multiple purposes: communication, warning, and preservation of knowledge. They allowed the family to convey information quickly, without risking exposure, to track events and resources, and to encode their history in a way that would survive even if other records were lost. The subtlety and complexity of this system revealed a level of foresight and intelligence that was both impressive and daunting. As night deepened, I shifted focus to the final set of artifacts, objects of personal and symbolic significance. Medallions, rings, and heirlooms had been carefully catalogued, their histories preserved alongside notes detailing their practical and emotional value. These items were more than mere possessions. They were extensions of identity and continuity, tangible threads, connecting the present to past generations. Each object carried lessons, reminders, and warnings, an unbroken line of wisdom, guiding the family in their quest for survival and discretion. By the end of the night, it became clear that the Van Horn family's existence was defined by strategy, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to preservation. Every decision, action, and precaution had been informed by an acute awareness of risk, a deep understanding of human behavior, and a relentless focus on continuity. Their survival had been no accident. It had been the product of deliberate, thoughtful, and often grueling effort. Leaving the chambers, I felt the weight of centuries pressing around me. The family's story was one of vigilance and adaptation, a testament to the power of foresight, intellect, and emotional acuity. They had not simply endured, they had engineered their endurance, crafting a legacy of resilience, secrecy, and calculated control. And as I walked back through the dimly lit hallways, I understood that their life, though hidden from the world, was an intricate masterpiece of survival, a narrative written in strategy, silence, and careful observation, destined to challenge anyone who sought to uncover the truth. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows, casting long, angular shadows across the family estate. After months of painstaking investigation, I had reached the culmination of the Van Horn family's hidden history, the final layer where truth and myth intertwined so tightly that even the sharpest observer might falter. Walking through the main hallway, the weight of centuries of secrecy seemed almost tangible. The air was thick with it, a silent witness to countless strategies, whispered warnings, and the relentless pursuit of survival. I began in the central study, the heart of the household's intellectual operations. Maps, ledgers, and meticulously maintained journals covered every available surface. The family had documented everything: alliances formed and broken, minor disputes amplified into lessons, subtle betrayals catalogued with precision. Every decision, whether involving finances, property, or personal safety, had been analyzed and reanalyzed. This was not a home where events unfolded haphazardly. It was a theater of strategy, every element deliberately orchestrated. The diaries revealed the extraordinary foresight of those who came before. In one passage, written nearly a century earlier. A family member detailed potential threats from distant relatives, outlining contingencies for espionage, betrayal, and exposure. Instructions were precise: who to trust, what documents to protect, which secrets were too dangerous to share. There was even a coded method for alerting heirs of immediate danger, using innocuous objects placed in specific positions. A seemingly ordinary chair, a shifted vase, a marked book on the shelf. The meticulousness was astonishing. A system designed to survive through generations, even if one member fell short of expectations. Venturing into the private chambers, I noticed the family's obsession with observation. Mirrors were positioned not for vanity, but for surveillance. Corridors allowed views into multiple rooms, giving occupants the ability to see without being seen. The layout of the estate was a physical manifestation of the family's psychological philosophy: control the line of sight, understand the terrain, anticipate behavior, and preserve autonomy. Every room had been crafted with this principle in mind, blending architectural elegance with strategic functionality. The most striking discovery, however, lay beneath the floors: an underground network of passageways, secret compartments, and concealed rooms. These spaces were not merely hiding places. They were command centers for monitoring, storing critical documents, and safeguarding valuable items. Small, narrow tunnels connected key points of the house, enabling discreet movement unseen by outside. Hidden panels and false walls concealed records that chronicled disputes, alliances, and sensitive family matters spanning generations. These underground corridors were a silent testament to the family's relentless commitment to discretion. I also encountered a set of artifacts that illuminated the emotional core of the family. Letters exchanged during periods of conflict revealed loyalty and affection, interwoven with tension and caution. Each note balanced emotional expression with careful consideration of how it might be perceived if intercepted. The Van Horns were masters of communication, encoding sentiment in language that could survive misinterpretation or surveillance, ensuring the continuity of trust while guarding against betrayal. The house itself told stories that words could not fully capture. Floors bore the subtle impressions of countless footsteps. Walls retained the faint echoes of whispered conversations, and even the scent of aged wood carried a memory of the past. Each creak, shadow, and draft was a part of a living, breathing archive of the family's existence. It was impossible not to sense the gravity of generations lived in calculated silence. Every moment weighed against consequence, every action considered for its long-term impact. As I delved into the family's legal records, the scope of their influence became clear. They had manipulated inheritances, preserved critical assets, and neutralized threats without leaving a trace of scandal. Their actions were guided by an unspoken code: protect the family's legacy, ensure continuity, and maintain secrecy at all costs. The brilliance of these methods lay not only in their effectiveness but also in their subtlety. Outsiders could never detect the full extent of the family's orchestration. They only perceived the outcomes, unaware of the intricate web of strategy that had produced them. Perhaps the most haunting revelation was the family's philosophy regarding mortality. They approached life and death with the same strategic precision that governed their interaction. Illnesses were treated with care and observation. Accidents were anticipated and mitigated whenever possible. Even aging was documented and analyzed to prepare heirs for eventual leadership. There was no recklessness, only measured action and force. In this, the Van Horns had mastered survival in both the tangible and intangible dimensions of existence. By afternoon, I reached the private library, a sanctuary of knowledge amassed over generations. Tomes filled with history, science, philosophy, and esoteric studies lined the walls. What stood out was not merely the breadth of learning, but the intentional curation of knowledge. Every volume had a purpose, every placement a rationale. Some books were guides to strategy and human behavior. Others contained coded histories of the family itself. The library was both a record and a toolkit, ensuring that those who inherited the estate could continue the family's legacy without misstep. As evening approached, I reviewed the final set of correspondences, letters, notes, and records detailing the family's interactions with the outside world. Here was a portrait of a lineage both formidable and fragile, capable of immense influence, yet burdened by the weight of its own history. They had lived in darkness not merely as a matter of secrecy, but as a protective mechanism, a shield against forces both known and unknown. Every action, every choice, had been dictated by the twin imperatives of survival and legacy. Standing in the central hall, as dusk fell, I reflected on the magnitude of what I had uncovered. The Van Horn family had endured through intelligence, foresight, and unwavering discipline. They had turned secrecy into an art form, strategy into a lifestyle, and survival into a legacy. Their story was not one of mere endurance. It was an intricate tapestry of human cunning, resilience, and the inexorable drive to preserve what they valued most. And in the quiet that followed, as the last light faded from the windows, I understood why the Van Horn family's name had been erased, not because they were forgotten, but because their power, precision, and secrecy demanded that the world never fully know their story. They had shaped their existence so completely that even history itself was forced to bend around them, leaving only shadows and hints for those daring enough to seek the truth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seat.